My next presenter will be the CEO of the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC, Richard Thornton.
It's a real shame I couldn't be there. I was always look forward to coming to Darwin, and just to make myself feel at home. I've got the heating cranked right up here and the humidifier on, and then I'm jumping in and out of the fridge every so often as we move around. My task, I think, in this one is just to give you a quick update on where the CRC is at, both in its current period of work, but also more generally in terms of what's coming beyond that, so that you have a view, I guess, of what to expect. So the CRC has been involved in the north of Australia for the past 17 years or so in its various guises. Indeed, I think the second field trip I ever did shortly after I started, back in 2004, I think, was a trip on the South Alligator River, looking at the issues of our biodiversity and how we reintroduce cool season fires across the wetlands in Kakadu. So we've been around for a long time, supporting the work that's been happening across the north of Australia. So what have we achieved in that time? We certainly achieved that 17 years of end user inspired and adopted research. Across the CRC as a whole, and this includes now the Bushfire CRC prior to the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC, there's been more than 150 PhD students completed through the CRC. We've delivered more than 150 substantial projects across the whole of that lifetime. And just in this CRC, the recently released evaluation of the impact of this CRC, it shows that of the roughly $200 million of cash and in kind that has been invested in research through the CRC, it's delivered a rate of return, if you like, of 1 in 6. So that's a substantial amount of return to the Australian community in one form or another. If you want a copy of that evaluation, and it does cover some really interesting things about how you can value some of the intangibles, particularly around trying to understand how research is adopted and used. It's on our website, as are a number of other studies that look at, the independent studies that look at how well the CRC has been doing adoption. But let me just say a little bit about where we are. As I said, we've been involved in Northern Australian research since about 2003. In the early days, it was with the Darwin CSIRO Centre, and with Bushfires NT and Fire and Rescue, but that's also moved in as well with Charles Darwin Uni. As many of you will be aware, the CRC runs until June next year. And what that means is that we have continuous funding up to that point. But what the focus is on at the moment is finishing off the things that we've started. So we have an intense focus now on the completion of the research utilisation projects. You've heard some of the outcomes of those today, the SMURF project, some of the work that's come out of RMIT on trying to understand hotspot detection using new satellite technology. But in addition to that, there are many products that will be of use across the north of Australia, including the Australian Disaster Resilience Index, which is a link to off their website, the Australian Exposure Index, which helps with the development of, I guess, risk management across the country, So there's many of those products that now are well and truly out there and are being used. There'll be many more workshops and webinars. What we've found over this challenging year of 2020 is that actually the webinar approach, although you miss out on the informal conversations during the breaks, has enabled us to reach many more people than we would have done if we'd have just held, for example, this webinar in Darwin with the 70 odd people that we would normally get to a normal RAF. We can reach 150, 200 people, and in some cases upwards of 500, 600 people. So that approach will continue in some form, but it's a matter of how we do that. I think Desiree said at the start, this is the first face-to-face event that we've done in a year. So it was about a year ago when we held our last face-to-face event before we had to start cancelling them. So it's great to be back on, being able to deliver directly to the people who need to use the research. You will have heard, maybe you'll have heard, it was the centre of our world at the time, that the federal government announced funding for a new world-class disaster research centre with a focus on natural hazard resilience and disaster risk reduction. As part of that, this CRC was provided an extra $2 million for this financial year to conduct research that followed on from the 2019-20 fire season. And I think following what I have to say here, then you'll hear a bit about one of those projects around traditional burning. Importantly, this new centre is just that. It's a new centre, so it's not a continuation of the CRC. In fact, it's a separate budget line in the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, which means that there are new guidelines, there are new processes we have to put in place. The establishment process has started. It's being led by the Department of Industry together with EMA in Home Affairs. They've appointed a facilitator, a person called Chris Pygram, who was the former CEO of Geosciences Australia, to engage with the broader partner base to discuss options for governance for the new centre, look at elements around the research scope, and importantly, try and find matching funding, particularly from the states and territories. It's clear that because this is an Australian-wide thing, that the north of Australia will be a critical part of that, and research that impacts on the resilience and disaster risk reduction issues across the whole 2/3 of the country that is northern, I guess, will be critical in where we go for that. We're working very closely with the Department of Industry and EMA on helping to shape that. It'll all happen fairly quickly, is my experience in these things, that everything happens slowly and then all of a sudden it's quick. So we will be in a position to start to define at least the initial 1 to 2 year research outline, and then a longer term view of what does that 10-year program start to look like very soon. So I'll shut up. I'm happy to take questions. So that's what we know so far.
Thanks, Richard. And you've shared your screen. You're so good. Well done. Okay, does anyone have any questions for Richard at this point? Oh, we do have a question for you, Richard. It's coming in from Kamal. She'll introduce herself, I guess.
Hello, Richard. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, I'd love to be there to say hello.
And we missed you yesterday. I think you would have enjoyed our conversations that we had for the first kind of this across the North dialogue between emergency management agencies and the Indigenous stakeholders. So I guess my question is, I would like to hear from you what could be the main research topics that you see for the North, the research gaps? How can we improve the emergency management services in the North, especially for the remote communities?
Look, I think there's a lot to digest around where we're at. That we've just had the Royal Commission. So there are a lot of issues that can be picked up out of the Royal Commission, particularly around lessons to be learnt around management of fire. I think from the work that the team up in Darwin have been doing, we've only just started to scratch the surface of how do we better integrate emergency management processes with traditional ways of doing things and the communities. And we know that a lot of those communities are all very different. And so it's how do we develop that? So some of those aspects are still important. I think the opportunity the new centre will possibly give us is to bring back some of the work that dropped off when we went from Bushfire CRC to B&H CRC because of the focus we had on disaster hazard, if you like, and look at the impact on ecology and how we value ecology and some of the aspects around fire management, cyclone management, flood management, and what the impacts are onto the impacts on the communities and the environments we live in. And I think that's a national issue, and it's not just a northern issue. It's worth saying at the moment, we don't control that agenda going forwards yet. That's still being part of the discussion that the Department of Industry, EMA, and the broader cohort of stakeholders are having. And obviously we're part of that conversation, but we're not running that agenda just at the moment.
Can you see the question on the chat?
Yeah, I can see the question. Look, I think one of the things that is likely to be different, and the question is around what will be the major difference in research focus, is that we will probably have substantially more resources to do more things. I think we need to be able to have a better handle on what do we really mean by resilience. We've started in this CRC to focus on that, but when we started, the only guide to what resilience really looked like was the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience. We now have, coming into this, a number of substantive pieces of policy work that have been completed, particularly around the framework for disaster risk reduction that's got signed off by the National Cabinet. We've got the Royal Commission outcomes, and we know that there's a much stronger focus on a lot of these issues internationally now as well. We're starting to see issues around insurability, around the role that the private sector plays. And I think that'll be a major shift. The new centre won't just be a public sector focused thing, if you like. If the disaster risk reduction framework tells us anything, that if we only focus on government, then we're missing 50% of the problem. So I think there's a lot of work we have to do to how do we engage into the not-for-profit sector, into the for-profit sector, with the insurance sector, the planning sector, the power sector, whoever it may be, and importantly, picking up a lot of the climate change issues that we probably didn't really focus on enough in this centre.
Thanks for all that clarification and for your presentation. We move on to the next one. You can put yourself back on mute. Thank you.